Hello and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. Today's conversation is with Greg Thomas, the CEO and co-founder of the Jazz Leadership Project. If you're not already subscribed, please subscribe, like, and comment to help the algorithm and enjoy the conversation. Welcome back to my channel. I used to go by Queen She. I am now Dr. Sheena Mason, and I'm here speaking with Greg Thomas. And our plan today is just to think out loud together, and we hope that you'll come along for the journey with us. Greg Thomas, welcome to the podcast. I want to pass the mic over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Dr. Sheena. I certainly appreciate that. Thank you for inviting me on your program, podcast. I am the CEO of the Jazz Leadership Project, which is a business that uses the principles and practices of jazz music as a methodology for leadership development and team development in organizations. And this is a theme that will come up, I think, time and time again in our conversation. For me, this is the application of culture in the world towards positive ends. So that's in terms of a position, but I'm also a longtime writer, cultural critic, and I've been published in many publications. Maybe we can just put a link where people can check some of that stuff out. And I have a blog that I run my partner and wife, Jewel Kinch Thomas, called tuneintoleadership.com. So folks can check that out. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm thrilled to have you here today because our last conversation was very enlightening and enriching. I know that viewers will take a lot from our talk today. The ultimate theme or thread or idea that I think connected us and encouraged you to reach out to me is this idea of cultural pluralism, is this idea of what Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison call Omni-American, is this idea of the work that many people are trying to do today that's being called anti-racism. There might be a more effective and efficient way to approach that same type of work. So with that on the table, can you explain a little bit to me about, like you've said repeatedly that you believe we should focus more on the cultural aspect as opposed to race, for example. What do you mean, and where did you find this inspiration, if you will, through the readers that I mentioned?
Okay. Well, they'd certainly inspired me, and I've got inspiration from many other sources too. First of all, there's a clear distinction among race, culture, and ethnicity. They are not the same thing, as you have often said on programs that I've heard you featured on in your own podcast. And so those distinctions are very important because if you mix those up, then things that properly belong in one bucket is put into another or mixed, and it becomes a muddy mess. So for me, race, which, as you realize through the work of Barbara and Karen Fields, is actually enabled by racism. And whereas race, from a biological perspective, is not a reality, racism is a very, very real reality. So ethnicity, you can look at ethnicity as certain traditions and practices by particular groups of people in particular times and places, that develop different forms, art forms, cuisine, dance, and that type of thing. That's also culture. Ethnicity and culture are very closely mixed together, are very closely tied. For me, culture, and Lord knows there's many, many definitions of culture. Culture has to do with, as Ellison once said, the things that people use to find what's abiding or to to pass on from generation to generation that allows them to express their values, the meanings they find in life. And they do this through certain forms. I've mentioned some already, artistic forms, musical, dance, visual arts, architecture. So those are actual expressions. But another way of looking at culture are intersubjective agreements that people have in terms of how it's like Seth Godin, who's a great business and marketing writer, he says culture is, people like us do things like this. It's a very basic description of culture. There are many, but for me, the distinction is very important because I have developed and I'm still in the process of expanding this term called cultural intelligence. I actually taught a course last year in 2020 called Cultural Intelligence, Transcending Race, Embracing Cosmos. And cultural intelligence, to me, is understanding what culture is and what culture does, what culture means, and bracketing it from race, which is, in a basic sense, phenotypic characteristics, skin color, and through racialization, the use of those to hierarchically place groups within racialized categories for the purpose of domination, oppression, exploitation. I mean, that's really the origin of it. So I have for many years now not bought into the lie of race. And I was helped along this process very much by my study of the work of Albert Murray, Ralph Ellison, Stanley Crouch, primarily, and also my wife, who was the executive and artistic director of the Riverside Theater at the Riverside Church. She had a program there. Oh my goodness, this must have been almost 20 years ago now, called Transcending Race. So that expression is something that really caught me. And I started to think about and study, how can we transcend race? How can we do that? And so I've actually been grappling with it for a long time. And I've been studying people who have really disavowed the very concept or their identification with the concept, which is why your work appeals to me so much. So there's a gentleman, Carlos Hoyt, who has a book that I'll share the title of with folks here, The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race. There's Transcending Race again, where he not only lays out a theoretical and philosophical basis for what he calls a non-racial identity, he also interviews and has case studies of people, everyday folks, who don't identify with race, because there are people like out here like that. There's Camille Foster, who has talks about race abolitionism. Thomas Chatterton Williams, in his work, has come to that place of being and thought. So I think that for me, it's really crucial to identify the things that are basis of difference and basis of, if not sameness, basis of shared understandings. So, but I'll leave it there. I mean, we have a lot to talk about, so I could keep going on and on. So why don't you just, come on in and let's just discuss this more.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I do have some questions for you. Um, this idea of transcending race, one who is not a skeptic such as myself or an eliminativist, perhaps, might ask, why is that a desirable thing? Why transcend race, right? Why not keep the concept or keep the language and just reconstruct it into something more positive or meaningful. And also, if people are racialized in a particular way and they view it as a positive thing as opposed to a negative thing, then that definitely begs the question of why transcend race at all.
Right. I would say that it's been pretty clear that the very idea and concept of race is part of a continuing basis for a misapplication of how we look at human beings. If we look at culture, we can say that every group of people, however you want to, divvy them up, has culture and has cultures. As far as race, there was a time where we didn't, as human beings, think in racial categories. There were other bases for differentiation, obviously. So, one, we didn't always think that way, so we don't have to continue. Um, we've seen the destructive results of racial and racialist thinking and racialization. And I think at some point, it will take people with the courage to actually say, no, that's it. I'm done with that idea. I understand that there are people who identify with it and have positive connotations that they try to impute to it. And I would argue that in most cases, they're really talking about cultural things, culture, that they're identifying in terms of positive dimensions. And with that, I'm with them. But you don't have to put it on race. I'll give you an example. Um, if you look at jazz music was created by Black Americans. When I say Black Americans, I mean an ethnic identity, a cultural identity, and a national identity. That's the American part, right? Because I have disavowed race and have embraced a non-racial identity, I use that term as I specify it. So the folks who founded and innovated jazz were Black Americans, no question, right? Now, they innovated the music not because their skin color was dark or because their facial features and their skull are particular shape. I mean, just when you say it just, it's so skin color, race, phenotypic characteristics, you know, they don't equate to an individual's state of consciousness, intelligence, awareness, and it doesn't even go to groups. Of course, when people believe in an idea, even if the idea doesn't have scientific validity, it will have real impact in the world because human imagination is a very powerful thing. And human belief systems are very, very powerful because imagination and beliefs then become behavior. And then you have results in the actual objective world. So I think if enough of us can look at race for what it is, can say racism is real, but one of the ways to fight racism is to transcend our identification with the very concept of race. That if we can get to a tipping point of people who will embrace that type of thought, I think we will go much further towards getting towards that Omni-American ideal that you alluded to earlier.
Do you think that part of transcending race, right? Do you think that part of that then will require us to come up with a different way to speak what we mean when we say something like Black American? Because it's been my experience that many people, as you said, conflate race with ethnicity and culture, other meaningful attributes of human society, and they conflate it and lump it up with race. And they often view race as the predictor of certain cultural outputs, right? So when I think of eliminating the concept of race for all of the reasons you've expressed and more, I think of also requiring a different language in terms of
Mm,
how we describe ourselves, because in the ways that we cannot extract racism from race, right? Because racism creates race.
mhm,
I also conclude that we cannot remove that from race language, language that's now
mm,
associated with race, right? So
mhm.
what do you think about that? And have you over time played around with language and using different words or terms as opposed to saying Black American?
Well, of course, there's a whole issue about African American, and I think, like you, I don't use that particular term because I confine that to actually Africans who have come over to America. I think they deserve to have that characterization. Um, yes, hundreds of years ago, we were descendants of Africans, but at this point here in America, we're a mixture. We are truly a composite of many different strands of human existence. So I am, from a cultural perspective, and even biological, because I did my 23andMe, um, primarily sub-Saharan African, but I've got European also, got a little Asian. But culturally, and this is the thing, culturally, we're really a mixture of many different elements. That's why out of many one, e pluribus unum, the nation's motto is so powerful and so important because you have these many streams that go into one mainstream of American identity, at least ideally, we do. So, in terms of language, you're right. I do think we need to, one, clarify what we mean when we use certain terminology. The reason, okay, so why do you use Black? Well, one, Ellison and Murray used Negro, okay, because that's in their generation, Negro Americans was the term of use. That fell out of favor in the 60s, particularly through the influence of Malcolm X. Um, so if I say Negro Americans, that'll sound to a historical and old fogyish, and people equate Negro with something negative since the 60s, which I think is a mistake. I think it's a historical and cultural mistake. I think it's important to look at the way language was used in past eras and understand that there's a reason why it was used. They fought, for example, to capitalize the N in the word Negro. So I don't want to leave those battles and say, hey, and I'm definitely not going to look at my ancestors and do what a lot of folks, I think, in the movement in the 60s did, was look at previous generations and cast aspersions on them. I'm not going to fall into that trap. So yes, we need to use different language. I define Black American the way I do. I know when people see Black, oftentimes think race, which is one of the reasons why I almost always say Black American. Okay. That's one thing. Two, I think when we want to make some clear distinctions as far as race, when we're talking about race, I think we can use language to help dissolve some of the automatic racial connotations. So you can say things like nominally white, nominally Black, in name, commonly ascribed as, racialized as. I think that, that's how we can use language to, what's the word? Well, one of the words is to complicate matters. I think in the academy, that's one of the things that's used. So, yes, language is important. And I think that, I mean, there's a whole, then I said African American, why I say Black American. One of the reasons I do is because Black was the term of use and became a point of pride for my Black American ancestors of my mother and father's generation. So I kind of identify with that and I'm cool with doing that. And you have to explain what you mean. Now, if more of us will, explain what we mean, at least for us, it'll be clarified. It's going to be tough to disentangle race and culture overnight. So some people would say then, okay, didn't say just Americans. Well, and this is where we get to Ellison and Murray. You have different idiomatic expressions. So idiom is a word to bring in. Ellison talked about the Negro American idiom. Albert Murray talks about the blues idiom. And what I like to do, if it's okay, is read to you a passage from Murray where he describes what he means by this. And I think it'll make it very clear. Okay? So this is from Conversations with Albert Murray, edited by a Murray scholar, a literature professor, Roberta S. McGuire, University Press of Mississippi. And this is from an interview in 1994 called Albert Murray on Stage, an interview by Lewis Edwards. And this is very close to the beginning of the interview. So Lewis Edwards says, so then the term Omni-Americans applies not just to African Americans, but to all Americans. And, well, maybe not to all people, perhaps we're discussing omni-humanity. Murray says, yes, absolutely. We're looking for universality. We're looking for the common ground of man. And what you're doing when you separate the American from all of that, you're talking about idiomatic identity. You see? And if you go from culture instead of the impossibility of race, because you can't define race, it doesn't meet our intellectual standard with a scientific observation and definition and whatever. It won't meet it. You see, race is an ideological concept. It has to do with manipulating people and with power and with controlling people in a certain way. It has no reality, no basis in reality. Because, see, if you try to make a genetic definition, has this gene, has that gene, how many of this gene or these genes or genes would it take to make you white or black or yellow or brown or red if you use this crude ratio? Now, how do you determine who has that many and where the line of demarcation is? It's an impossible situation. So what you enter into to make sense of things are patterns and variations in culture. People do the same things, have the same basic human impulses, but they come out differently. The language changes because of the environment and so forth. Now, you can get the environment, you can get the cultural elements, and from those things, you can predict the behavior of people pretty well. But if you look at things such as, if you look at such racial characteristics as may be used, whether it's the shape of certain body parts, the texture of their hair, the lips and all, you cannot get a scientific correlation between how the guy looks and how he behaves. If you find a large number of people who look like each other and behave like each other, it's because of the culture. Because there are too many other variations. If you got guys from stovepipe black to snow blonde, you're going to find all the variations in mankind, even though idiomatically they might speak the same, they might sound the same. So just think of, black Brits who sound just like other Brits, so that's an example. So you see how he's talking about cultural variation, idiomatic variations, and opposing that to race.
Yeah, it's still tangled even in my own even in my own mind, because I don't know, when I think of Elaine Locke, for example, he talks about how culture creates race, which is the exact opposite of how people tend to think of it, right? Most people think that race creates culture.
Hmm.
When I think of it, when I think of race and culture in that way, I think I actually concede to Locke's position that culture
Mhm.
creates race. America, in this instance or context, American culture creates race. Now, if it creates race, largely because I'm also
I'd
viewing
say,
race and racism as the same thing, then
mhm.
how one question I have is, to Locke's mind, because culture creates race, you can be a racialized white person and you can still create black art. So what do you think about that? Like, what is your view on that? Because I still think if we connect culture with anything that has to do with race, which also gets conflated with ethnicity, I still feel like it's too tangled, right? Because we can look the same and we can participate in very different cultures.
Mhm. Right, we sure can. Um, can you say more about what Locke you think Locke meant by culture creates race?
Yeah, so he concedes, of course, that race is not biological, right? And uh, but he talks about how in society people still talk about it in very biological terms, and because they talk about race in biological terms, even though at the time that he's doing this work, 1920s, uh, even though it had been disproven, he points out that people still then are deciding what black art is, right? Black indicating ethnic and cultural outputs, right? He's still pointing to the fact that people deciding and defining this category of black art are doing so from a naturalist perspective of race. So indeed, they're looking at a person's skin color, or they're looking at phenotype, or they're looking at ancestry. When you have people like Gene Toomer or Charles Chestnut or Walter White being racialized as black, so everything they create is black art. So he points to complicating that practice because he says, after all, culture produces race, which is also, to my mind, I extend that to say culture produces racism, right? Like racism
Mm,
is part of culture, um, and so if that's the case, then my brain can't help but go into how does one how does one consider cultural formation in a more nuanced and also rooted in reality way without that slippage of race, or naturalism creeping into that thing. And when
mhm,
when Locke escapes it because he says, "Oh yeah, right now the practice is to say that black art is created by essentially black people, right? Black
mhm,
both as a
mhm.
race and as an ethnicity." Um,
Right.
but he says that's the practice, but he dispels that because he says white people create black art too. And then he said they can do it poorly, right? That's the thing. There's still hierarchy of art according to
Mhm.
Locke, but that they can still, for all intents and purposes, create this thing called black art. So what do you think about that? I want to hear more about your perspective on culture and how we can identify, or the practicality of even identifying these idioms that you're speaking of.
Mhm. Okay. All right. So I would say that Locke is a precursor in many ways to Ellison and Murray. He influenced them, but I would say that they were able to take some of his philosophical insights and provide um, further clarification than Locke did. Um, I would also say that I'll use an expression of Murray's. They extended, elaborated, but refined some of the ideas of Locke. So I don't know. If we go historically, look at Bacon's Rebellion, and we looked at the elites of the time, white elites, excuse me, people described as white, as elites, and they became known as white. They saw indentured servants who were white, black, to use those terms, um, actually collaborating together and to make clear distinctions and to separate, and some of this has to do with class, to separate, particularly in terms of labor pools, those who then became identified as white and those of color, Black and otherwise, they started literally using the term white in legal documents, okay? So that's not the kind of culture I'm talking about. That's creating categories, as Murray said, for the sake of power, for domination. I don't say that's culture. When I say culture, when I talk about American culture, I'm talking about what Ellison and Murray call vernacular culture. They're influenced by John A. Cohenhoven, former Barnard professor of literature, who talked about American culture being a combination of homespun ways and means of creating out of the environment and out of the resources that you had before you, plus the learned traditions from Europe, a combination of those, okay? That doesn't have anything to do per se with race. It has to do with groups of people creating in their environment, forms that gave meaning to their lives, okay? There's another way of looking at American culture where you take Constance Rourke, her book, American Humor, which has to do with not just the comedy tradition, but American humor as humor character, American character. And she says there are archetypes. These archetypes, the three primary archetypes, she called it the backwoodsman, we could say Native American, the Yankee peddler, and the Negro. These three archetypes, and particularly the Negro, she used an expression, she said they were emblems for a pioneer people who required resilience as a prime trait. That statement alone makes Constance Rourke for Murray a patron saint, okay? So again, this is not talking about race per se, but it is difficult to entangle. There's no question, it's difficult to entangle, but to further clarify, I'd like to read another passage, because you said Black art. That's not a term I use. I want to specify, are we talking about Black American? Are we talking about Black Caribbean? And if Caribbean, are we talking about Trinidadian, Jamaican? I mean, let's get specific, you know? You could get even more specific here in this country. I know I say Black American, but there's different traditions and idioms from Black folks in the South, the Midwest, the West, you know, so we could really get specific. But this passage by Ellison, if you substitute the word Negro for Black, you'll see the point that I'm making. So this is an interview from 1958. This was from the collection of essays and interviews called Shadow and Act. And the title of this is Some Questions and Some Answers. The first question, what do you understand today by Negro culture? You could have said Black culture. Now check out his answer. He says, what I understand by the term Negro culture is so vague as to be meaningless. Indeed, I find the term Negro vague even in its racial connotations. For in Africa, there are several non-white racial strains, and one suspects that the term came into usage as a means of obliterating cultural differences between the various African peoples. And he's talking about Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasian. He's talking about those derivations. In this way, the ruthless disruption. Now, check out how this is. As I read this, I realize this is very similar to the way the Field sisters uncover how racism creates race. So he's saying here, you use the term Negro, in this way, the ruthless disruption of highly developed cultures raised no troubling moral questions. The term, used mainly by whites, represented a, quote, trained incapacity, unquote, to make or feel moral distinctions where Black men were concerned. Obviously, the language is genderized in his generation. As for the term culture used in this connection, I know of no valid demonstration that culture is transmitted through the genes. In Africa, the Blacks identify themselves by their tribal names. Thus, it is significant that it is only in the US that, that the term Negro has acquired specific cultural content. Spelled with a capital N by most publications, one of the important early victories of my own people in their fight for self-definition, the term describes a people whose origin began with the introduction of African slaves to the American colonies in 1619, and which today represents the fusing of the original African strains of many racial bloodlines, among them English. Now, of course, he's still using race and racial, okay? But it's the mixture that we're talking about. That's the key thing. The mixture of the African strains with English, Irish, Scotch, French, Spanish, and American Indian. Although the American Civil War brought an end to the importation of African peoples into the US, this mixture of bloods has by no means ceased, not even in the South, where the whites are obsessed with racial purity, so that today anthropologists tell us that very few American Negroes are of pure African blood. It occurs to me, in light of this, even if culture were transmitted through the bloodstream, we would encounter quite a problem in explaining just how the genes bearing Negro culture could so overpower those bearing French or English culture, which in all other ways are assumed to be superior. But to continue, I love this because he defines Black Americans here. We call it American Negroes. But to continue, the American Negro people are North American in origin and have evolved under specifically American conditions, climatic, nutritional, historical, political, and social. They take their character from the experience of American slavery and the struggle for and the achievement of emancipation, from the dynamics of American race and caste discrimination, and from living in a highly industrialized and highly mobile society possessing a relatively high standard of living and an explicitly stated egalitarian concept of freedom. Its spiritual outlook is basically Protestant. Its system of kinship is Western. Its time and historical sense are American, United States, and its secular values are those professed, ideally at least, by all of the people of the United States. Culturally, this people represents one of the many subcultures which make up the great amalgam of European and Native American culture, which is the culture of the United States. This American Negro culture is expressed in a body of folklore, in the musical forms of the spirituals, blues and jazz, an idiomatic version of American speech, especially in the Southern United States, a cuisine, a body of dance forms, and even a dramaturgy, which is generally unrecognized as such because it is still tied to the more focused Negro churches. Some Negro preachers are great showmen. It must, however, be pointed out that due to the close links which Negro Americans have with the rest of the nation, these cultural expressions are constantly influencing the larger body of American culture and are in turn influenced by them. That's what Locke called reciprocity. That's that process. Nor should the existence of a specifically Negro idiom in any way be confused with vague racist terms, white culture, or Black culture. Rather, it is a matter of diversity within unity. One could indeed go further and say that in this sense, there is no other Negro culture. Haitians, for instance, are an American people and predominantly dark, but their culture is an expression of Haitian conditions. It reflects the influence of French culture and the fusion of Catholic and native Haitian religious outlooks. Thus, since most so called Negro cultures outside Africa are necessarily amalgams, it would seem more profitable to stress the term culture and leave the term Negro out of the discussion. It is not culture which binds the people who are of partially African origin, now scattered throughout the world, but an identity of passions. We share a hatred for the alienation forced upon us by Europeans during the process of colonization and empire, and we are bound by our common suffering more than our pigmentation. But even this identification is shared by most non white people. And while it has political value of great potency, its cultural value is almost nil. That's a long quote, but it shows you some of the nuances that Ellison, off the top of his head, okay, this is an interview. This wasn't written, laid down. So, what would you say? Hopefully, that answers your question. I hope, in part. It's not that we're going to resolve this. I mean, this is complex, but
Right,
there are
right,
there
exactly.
are
Yeah, so so a few things stood out to me because all of that still encourages and affirms my um current line of inquiry, which is such that what benefit is there to using the language of Black American art, Black American culture, or the shorthand is Black art, or at during Locke's time is Negro art, which is why I just inverted Negro to Black, right? That from the beginning, there are certain thinkers like George Schuyler, very controversial, lesser known and lesser liked, who comes out with his essay, The Negro Art Hokum, right? And in that essay, he says, there is no Negro art. There is no Negro culture. Translation, there is no Black American culture. He says maybe on the continent of Africa, their Negro culture exists, right? But in America, because it is an amalgam, because of the history that is America, right? That the cultural formation changed and shifted such that we might be able to point to distinct types of ethnicities that are influencing the culture, right? But that ultimately the culture is a new culture, such that pointing to distinctions or insisting that there is a difference to Schuyler's mind is the same as insisting that there is an inherent racial difference, which to Schuyler's mind is the same as insisting in racism, right? Because if you are insisting on racial difference, then you are affirming and confirming racist beliefs about human beings. So for me, as somebody who's still constantly perplexed and thinking about all things, race, culture, ethnicity, nation, when I think of, or when I hear people talk about Black as a culture or Black as an ethnicity, I do tend to lean into a sort of integrationist view, such that Elaine Locke says, okay, Schuyler, I hear you, you're wrong. There is a distinct thing called Black American culture, right, or Black art that is distinct. But that being said, that distinctiveness needn't be recognized as something separate from the larger American culture. And in fact, that's why he views people of all walks of life being able to participate in this thing called Black culture, specifically, that it should be taught within the context of American culture. He had a very integrationist view, which is not to be confused or muddled with an assimilationist view, right? Not in Locke's instance, anyway. Whereas
mhm,
Schuyler
mhm.
might have been an assimilationist, and so that's the kind of path that I'm walking right now, is really analyzing and considering all the ways in which, what benefit is there to to distinguishing or making differences if it is, after all, still part of American culture. And I also tend to view culture in ways that you've articulated, but also inspired by Caribbean writers like Edward Glissant, who's French Martinican writer, who talks about his theory of creolization and poetics of relation. So identity as being rhizomatic as opposed to having a single origin. All of these ideas mesh very well with the likes of Ellison and Murray and Locke.
Absolutely.
Um,
Stuart Hall could be
Stuart
mentioned in
Hall,
that context. Hmm.
Orlando Patterson. I mean, the
Hmm.
list goes on across history, right? And
That's right.
so I I
But you asked a question. Can I just, if I could just
of
come?
course.
Okay, thank you. So out of many, one. It's not just the one. It's the many also. So to answer your question as to why we make certain distinctions, I am making certain idiomatic distinctions. Okay. Even those idiomatic distinctions are mixed, though. It's a convenience. Now, people use race as a convenience. I'm separating myself from that, but it's also a convenience to talk about Black American culture overall. The reality is there are Black American cultures. That's the reality. Jazz is one of those expressions, or the blues idiom is one of those expressions, okay? I center on blues and jazz. And this is Locke too, because Locke talks about gifts. Du Bois talked about gifts of culture also. So Black Americans are a combination of streams of African influence, European influence, Caribbean influence. So when I say Black American, that's a mixture right there. When you look at the actuality of the streams that formed American culture. Now, for people who focus on race, the idea of Black, I mean African and European. Wait, how can that? Because they're thinking about race. But the actuality is, if you look at the development of Black American culture or Negro American culture, or what Sterling Stuckey calls slave culture, it's a combination of these elements. Jazz itself is a combination of these elements, okay? But there is, as Ellison said, you can look at something distinct in the formation of what we call Black American or Negro American culture, right? Because there are certain forms that develop as expressions of that. The spirituals, blues, jazz, and then of course, we haven't even talked about literature, okay? Now, your area of Spelche and of course, Ellison and Murray's. So, but the point is, it's not that these things are racially in a box. That influence is still there, the mixture of influence. So out of many, one. The many are there, but you're pointing to a oneness, at least ideally also. The last reading I'm going to do, and this is shorter, because I want to talk instead of just be reading passages. This is important because this is Ellison again from a presentation he did in 1963 called What These Children Are Like, okay? Talking about Negro American children. He says, thus, we must recognize that the children in question are not so much culturally deprived, which was a term of use at the time, as products of a different cultural complex. I'm talking about how people deal with their environment, about what they make of what is abiding in it, about what helps them to find their way, about that which helps them to be at home in the world. All this seems to me to constitute a culture. If you can abstract their manners, their codes, their customs, and attitudes into forms of expression, if you can convert them into forms of art, if you can stylize them and give them many and subtle ranges of reference, then you are dealing with a culture. People have learned this culture It has been transferred to them from generation to generation. And in its forms, they have projected their most transcendent images of themselves and of the world. Let's talk about jazz now. Yes, Black Americans who are a mixture, who are an amalgam, created blues and jazz. Others found that it touched them and that they wanted to express what their values and meaning and identities were through those forms. And they weren't all folks who are racialized as Black. There are many, just like in basketball. Now it's an international sports where people, they've adapted Black American style internationally. And so you find, in those stylistics. So we're talking about cultural dynamics. So in jazz, you have a whole history of great players who are racialized as white, who didn't allow what Murray called the folklore of white supremacy or the fake law of Black pathology to determine whether or not their soul and their hearts were inspired by this music. And they said, I'm going to dedicate my life to this music. Okay. Bix Beiderbecke, Frankie Trumbauer. I mean, so many. I can come up to Stan Getz, Zoot Sims, Paul Desmond, one of my favorites of all time, Phil Woods. I mean, the list goes on and on. We're talking about culture. Once a culture comes into manifestation as a form of expression, it becomes a gift to the world, and therefore anyone, if they're willing to respect the form and the art, can learn it if they devote themselves to it. Is Leontine Price and Shirley Verrett appropriating European culture by becoming opera singers? No, that's ridiculous. It's culture, and it's a cultural gift to the world. So they express themselves in that. That's why the distinction and separating or bracketing of race and culture is so important. We have to emphasize it over and over and over again, in my estimation. Even though it's going to get confused, we have to keep separating it.
Yeah, because to my mind, at least when I hear you talk, right, it's more evidence for me why I keep going down this path of inquiry. Because, so here's why, right?
Okay.
When you talk about how the word Black itself, right, any race category, if we apply it to the practice of culture, it's not supposed to signal homogeneity, right? It's not supposed to signal a monolith, because to your point, there are countless Black American cultures, plural, right? And so the problem with including race or in the language that is steeped in race, it doesn't only encourage the conflation of the two, but it also, for the average person, not for you or I, Greg, we've gotten ourselves out of the trap, right? But it also does encourage people to wash over the differences, meaningful differences that do exist, right? Like, not all racialized Black people speak the same language. We don't eat the same foods, even in the same country. We don't, right? We don't wear the same clothing. We don't, listen to the same music, all of that. And so part of my current intellectual efforts is really coming to form my own more solidified conclusions and ideas about race, but also how to, because I'm about that life of decolonizing the imagination, specifically the racialist imagination, also figuring out how do more of us get what we want and say more clearly what we mean when we use race language, and what are the alternatives to race language. The primary thing that I've come up with, which I never saw coming, Truly, Greg. I never saw these changes in my own mind coming, because for a lot of people, this is an emotional thing. It's a spiritual thing. It
Yeah,
feels personal and
yeah,
subjective, right? So
right.
even me, I fought my own ideas for a long time, but I recently came to conclude, and I'm leaning into uh, the second passage you read from Ellison at the end, where he says we would do well to put the word Negro aside, right? Um, to
Mm,
me, that's where I'm leaning, because I don't
mm,
have a sufficient alternative. Like for a while, I was like, oh, I'll
mm,
just say African American when I'm speaking about ethnicity or culture, because I
mm,
do recognize the distinction. But I still
mm,
think that that falls short of what I'm really trying to get at and the problem that I'm pointing to. And in an effort to in an effort to, I guess, liberate the language and thereby liberating our thoughts and our behaviors, I think it's important, and these are important distinctions, in part because as they currently stand and operate, it is such that if I look a certain way, I'm expected to practice culture in a certain way. And that's just not based in reality. It's not based in
absolutely.
reality, especially considering the fact that we have, as you said, many Black cultures, plural. And that to me is like, that to me is significant, because we promote and privilege this idea that does unintentionally, in a lot of instances, promote hegemonic views of entire populations of people,
Mhm,
and in it extends the violence of racism, right? Because in washing
mhm,
over those meaningful differences,
mm,
we often aren't aware of the meaningful differences. You know, we think
mm,
we convince ourselves that everyone is the same if they look a certain way or if they're in a particular race group. And I think that those differences, if we do are successful in abolishing the idea of race, those differences would come to the surface, and we would have more language, or we would invent more language to describe those sort of ethnic or cultural differences. And it would also promote a better, it would give people better tool to see the shared humanity that you're speaking of, right? That we find so critical, that
mm,
Ellison finds so critical, this idea of
right,
what is universal. Because as it
right,
stands, because race is infiltrating seemingly everything, and by race I'm really
yeah,
meaning racism, right?
right,
Because that's infiltrating everything, the universal is often absent from the communication, and from the efforts and from the practices, to the point
right,
where I'm pulling my hair out, because I'm like, man, we are all human. And that sounds
right,
floofy and romantic, but we have
right,
more in common than we have different from each other. And the differences we
right.
do have are meaningful, and they shouldn't be ignored, right? But people
Okay.
presume all of these differences because of race.
But
Racism.
that's why the word idiomatic, I think needs to become a part of our vocabulary. Because the very first Murray quote that I read talks about how you have idiomatic variations in culture. Okay. Now, I I will have to continue wrestling with my decision to lean on Black American with my own definition and explanation, knowing that there's confusion over the word Black. And even though I'm trying to have a qualifier, Black American, like what kind of Black? American, okay? That because of the confusion among ethnicity, culture, and race, if there's a better term, well, I mean, when I talk about, and maybe this is why, for example, um, Ellison talked about the Negro idiom or Negro American idiom. Maybe that's why Murray started talking about the blues idiom, because it focused on the form of art and not on the group of people and a racialized aspect of it. So that could have been part of why he made that particular distinction, you know? So that's
That's a
certainly
really good
one.
point. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one, and I think that we should continue grappling with it and talking about it in discourse to see how we can creatively come up with different language, because I mean, it's through our imaginations and through language that we, as Ellison says elsewhere, we actually create reality.
Mm.
So the language we use is so important because it's not just rhetoric, it's actually how you create reality. Okay.
Yes. Preach. Preach. The number of times people try to tell me it's just semantics. I'm like, no, actually it's not. But that's an easy way to dismiss the value of
Right.
anything I say, right? Okay, so one thread that I want to continue to pull a little more with you and think aloud is on the topic of appropriation. Something you said that really resonates with me, it's very timely. It was something to the effect of how culture is universal, right? Or perhaps the best type of cultural products are universal. They speak to the human experience, they speak to humanity, right? Um, this topic comes up inevitably in most of the classes that I teach, and it came up in my Black Modern Literature course recently. I had a guest speaker, Jacoby Carter from Howard University, come and talk with my students. And one of my students asked him the question, if I participate in another people's culture, is that racist? And Dr. Carter was awesome because he asked, why would that be racist, right? Like, why would that be considered racist? And I could tell that the student who asked and the rest of the students in the classroom were a little surprised because there are certain ideas that get promoted in public discourse that seem rarely questioned, right? People take
Right.
for granted if something is racist or if it isn't, right?
Right.
So it led to what I felt like was a really fruitful conversation because Dr. Carter ultimately said, that culture, nobody owns culture, right? Like, who owns the Mona Lisa? An Italian made the Mona Lisa, but who owns it? And everyone's wheels were turning. And ultimately, he said that the best cultural products are universal in nature. And they are, once you create something, it's out there for people to appreciate, it's out there for people to participate, that there can
Mm-hmm.
be a way in which people participate disrespectfully, right? But that ultimately, this topic of ownership and cultural appropriation, the way that we see it play out in pop culture and discourse,
Mm-hmm.
he says it doesn't lead to many generative outcomes, right? Like, if anything, we
Right.
keep holding on to this idea of ownership. So,
Mm-hmm.
what is your position on that, right? Like, you have the Jazz Leadership Project. I'm guessing, based on knowing you and knowing a little bit about how you think, that you don't uh, stop any person from participating and making jazz music, right?
Oh my
Or the
God.
project. So,
Oh my God.
where's so how do you think about that? And then also, this question of respect and disrespect constantly comes up. How do you know if a person is participating in a disrespectful way? I don't take that for granted, that idea that it requires respect, because then my next question is, well, how does one do it respectfully, right? So
Right.
talk to
Right.
me about that. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Um, I've thought about this pretty deeply. I would say that when we're talking about appropriation, I think it's accurate to call it appropriation if, say, in an art form, if someone comes along and says that they invented an art form and didn't give credit to the actual creators, that's appropriation. Okay. So when Benny Goodman, who helped integrate jazz by bringing in Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton into his band and orchestra, so he's a hero in that sense. But when he's put, I'm sorry, not Benny Goodman in this sense, Paul Whiteman in the 20s, where he's called the king of jazz. Now, whether he called himself that or not, that's how he was promoted. That's appropriation, okay? Because he wasn't no king of jazz, All right. Now I thought of Benny Goodman. I thought of Benny Goodman because Benny, no, not Benny Goodman. See, I'm mixing up my ascribed white people. Uh, Dave Brubeck got on the cover of Time magazine before Duke Ellington, the greatest jazz composer and probably American composer of the 20th century. So they were in the same hotel. They were playing at some jazz festival. And Duke Ellington comes and knocks on Dave Brubeck's door. And he shows them the cover of Time magazine with Dave Brubeck on the cover before Duke Ellington, who since the 20s, Brubeck got big in the 50s. Duke was already a living legend internationally by then. And it was such a shameful thing. Now, that is how media plays into cultural appropriation. So I don't want to just disavow that there's no cultural appropriation. But the irony is that appropriation is how culture works. It's like you try some of this, you try some of that, you put some of this with that, and let me try this on for size. And see, the thing is, I'm a New Yorker. I was born in Brooklyn, okay? And, and so I'm used to all of this ethnic mixtures and stuff. I mean, I'm just used to that. And to me, I grew up eating knishes and stuff, it's like from different ethnic and cultural groups. And it's fun. And that's why, when you have racialized white young people who were the biggest buyers of hip hop, it wasn't appropriation. There was something that they identified with and something that helped define their youthful identity and them being against, probably adult culture,
Yes.
So,
And it speaks to how it's part of American culture. Like American culture is what some people dub Black culture. It is. It's there. It's there. That's the evidence.
It's profoundly an influential aspect of all of American culture. And that was one of Ellison and Murray's and Stanley Crouch's. This culture we're talking about is integral to American culture overall and helps define what it is and what its identity is, okay? As an integral part. It's not the only part, but it's a big part.
Yes.
And it's that cultural power and influence that's a point of pride for me and a point of identification, not for racial reasons, for cultural reasons.
Right.
Because we're talking about values, meaning, traditions, lifestyles, idioms, okay? Something that we all have or should have, because we are now in a postmodern age,
right,
where a lot of traditional forms are not there. And this is probably one of the reasons that there's so much anxiety and anomie and depression, and because people need cultural forms to pass on to other generations that provide, ways of having, meaning in your life, meaning in families, meaning in groups, ritual and myth. All these things are so important and are usually found in literature and other art forms. It's closely tied. That's in Ellison and Murray also. So cultural appropriation thing, I mean, it's overdone so much because people don't have what I'm calling cultural intelligence. They don't have the cultural literacy to understand distinctions between culture, race, and ethnicity. They don't have an orientation to actually understand that there are cultural formations that we can call actually traditional, modern, postmodern. Those are cultural formations too, large-scale cultural formations. That's a form of cultural intelligence to be able to make those kind of distinctions also. And when you are able to make these distinctions, then you have a better grasp on what we ultimately share in common. I mean, you know this by your study of literature, and they talk about universality. I mean, in postmodernity, very much they really didn't like the universality concept. But there are human universals. Thank goodness. Music is a human universal. Art is a human universal. And it's okay, folks. um, but dig this. Here's where we get to nuance. The universal comes from the particular. The one comes from the many. So the more you can express the particularity of a particular idiomatic artistic form and expression, the more universal it becomes, because when people read literature, if I'm reading about a culture that I've never seen or lived, but through the process of story and narrative, I'm able to identify with rounded characters in the literature. I'm able to identify with the story arc and the emotional struggles that the person has in their subjective experience and all of that. I'm then able to share in identification of that culture. That's why reading is so important, because if you don't have the ability to travel a lot, you can travel in your mind and your imagination. So this is why literacy, not just numeracy and not just learning to read, read and write and arithmetic, cultural literacy is so important. And that's why I posit what I'm calling cultural intelligence too.
Thank you so much. This is making me think about how we started this conversation, right? Essentially, one of the things that tied us together and connected us was this imagining of a future in which race and racism by connection don't exist.
Right.
Do you consider yourself an eliminativist? Are you encouraging the abolition of race?
Yes,
And
I definitely am. Mhm.
do you consider yourself a constructionist or a skeptic?
Based on how you laid it out, I would have to say a skeptic. Now, I wonder the origins of that particular formation or formulation, who coined it, why skeptic? Because, I usually don't like to identify with being skeptical, though there are things, of
Right.
course, I'm skeptical about.
Right.
But in the philosophical terms, as you laid them out, I would definitely identify with being a skeptic. When I read Racecraft by the Field Sisters, and I saw how they dissed social constructionism, that laid a foundation. I
They
was
do.
like,
They
oh
do this.
man, because I went to grad school. I did 4 years of a doctoral program in American Studies at NYU. And boy, social constructionism was the rage. That was
Yeah.
all the rage.
It still
So I
is.
was
It still is.
I know. So I can understand, social constructionism, because okay, it's not biologically real, but it did form in societies and certain structures, and so we could say it's a social construction. So maybe I'm somewhere in between the two, but
Hmm.
because I now see the critique of social constructionism, I would definitely say I'm a skeptic.
You're leaning skeptic. Awesome. I like it.
Yeah.
But it's always important to note that one needn't be a skeptic to be an eliminativist. So for folks out there who see themselves as constructionists, this does not preclude you from still concluding that the abolition of race is a necessary and would be a generative undertaking. So the last thing I want to talk about to this point is something Dr. Carter said to my class also when he came and spoke with them. It was something to the effect of calling me crazy. He said, I am crazy. And I said, oh, okay, all right. This is embarrassing. This is in front of my students, right? Then he's like, well, if it makes you feel any better, you're crazy like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, who dreamt of and imagined a world in which they could go with their families to any restaurant they want, enjoy a meal, and go home. Or Nelson Mandela, who imagined a non apartheid South Africa. And he mentioned Gandhi, but I don't know enough about Gandhi to pretend that I know the struggle that he went through and overcame. He said these people had no context or very little context, certainly no lived experience in a world that didn't exist as it was at the time. And they were crazy enough to imagine a radically different world. And
Mm,
people during the time and up to the time of the people I named and any other change agents in human society across
mhm,
time and across history have been considered crazy. So
mm.
you and I, as skeptics and definitely as eliminativists, we might be a little crazy, as I think really most people are. But
I won't deny it. And I've been called worse, you know.
we are we are crazy in the sense that we imagine a world in which this thing that seems so intertwined in American life especially can not be intertwined in American life. And I really appreciate the fact that you've come, you've spoken with me. We've shown some nuances in the different ways that we're thinking about things, especially culture and cultural formation. But also, I hope that the threads of similarities in how we're viewing things, and also how we ultimately see the world going forward, right? And what we're striving for, that those similarities and commonalities shine through as well. Because one thing that I think trips people up, especially as it pertains to social movements, is this general belief that we have to agree on every single aspect of
Yeah.
everything in order to work together to get the thing that we want, right? And the fact that we have had shared goals across time hasn't inspired more cohesion around the shared goals, and people have gotten historically tripped up over those differences. So I let it be known that we have a shared goal, right? And in that way, hopefully we can move forward with our differences and agree to disagree in some areas, right? But ultimately, that end vision, what we imagine our future being in American society, we have the same objectives or the same hopes for the future. So I just want to highlight that for anyone out there. Um, and I think it's a significant aspect of current discourse that's absent. People get too hung up on differences, like way too hung up on
A-
differences.
Absolutely. I mean, Murray in the Omni-Americans, his first book published in 1970, said that ethnic diversity is, I'm paraphrasing, is part of the dynamism of the country. You know, it's a part of the beautiful. It's beautiful. You know, you don't have to get hung up in differences. Now, there's a great uh, thinker, writer, facilitator named Diane Musho Hamilton. And my partner and wife and I did some studying with her on facilitation. We facilitate workshops virtually and in person before COVID in person. And we did some training with her. She talks about how you have difference and sameness, and that sameness energetically feels good, right? Difference brings tension, brings some like, but it's a question of perspective and how you deal with it. Actually, differences are exciting because sameness is kind of smooth, right? So, but when you have differences, like, ooh, ah. Now let me tell you how Murray dealt with difference. That is one of many of his brilliant formulations. He said, you know, usually when you deal with difference, historically, there's two ways of approaching it. He says one way is xenophobia. okay? Ethnocentrism, being afraid and putting the other in the corner. He said the other way is exotica, where it's like, that's different. You know what I mean? That's another way of looking at difference. So he says both are real and a part of human history. You don't have to be ashamed of it, but what you do is embrace it and synthesize it so it can be generative and go to another level. See, that's that. When you talk about certain geniuses, boy, I haven't heard many talk about those kind of insights. So difference does not, you're right, have to be the basis of us not being able to dialogue, communicate, and work together, you know? Because
Absolutely.
differences, we're more, there's so many differences and so many bases for differences that you're not going to get rid of them. So
Hmm.
why not only tolerate them, appreciate them? And it's okay, you
Right.
know, and
And
agree to disagree and still work together and still engage in dialogical communication and pragmatic action together.
yes, and practice what many of us preach, especially when it comes to social justice efforts, which is that not all of us are the same. Not all of us should be the same. Let's practice more of what we preach so that we can adhere to some of the ideas that we promote and privilege, but then in practice tend to ignore, subfuse or overlook. Greg, before we part ways, I want to invite you to share information about an upcoming event that I'm participating in. The link, of course, to the event is going to be in the description box, but tell us more.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being a part of this event, which is entitled Combating Racism and Anti-Semitism Together, Shaping an Omni-American Future. So we're against racism and anti-Semitism. We're for a shared Omni-American future. I mentioned that the Omni-American is the title of Murray's first book. So this conference, which brings together scholars, educators, organizations, everyday folks who are interested in being against those things and for a shared future together. The Omni-American ideal is based on what I've been riffing on, e pluribus unum. So Omni-American is another way of saying all American, and it talks about how America is a mixture of elements, components, ethnicities, cultures, idioms, but we still have a shared identity and moving towards the very ideals embodied in what Ellison called our sacred documents, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. I would put Lincoln's second address, inaugural address, with that, and the Gettysburg Address. Certain things that are just, foundational in terms of what are American ideals that we're moving towards. So that's what Omni-Americanism is. And so there are similarities and differences in the struggle that what I'm calling Black Americans and Jewish Americans have. There are distinctions, but there are shared. So we're sharing in that fight, but we're also moving towards something positive. So this event is taking place. It'll be webcast on October 25th, 24th, and 25th. People can get more information to see who all the participants are and who all the organizations who are partnering with us at event.omniamerican.org. That's event.omniamerican.org. And just to give you a little sample of some of the people who are involved, Wynton Marsalis, who's getting the first annual Albert Murray Award for Omni-American Excellence. You've got, in terms of musicians, Itamar Borokov, great trumpeter, Israeli, who loves and plays jazz. He's a part of it. Donald Harrison, great, like Wynton, artist, musician from New Orleans. He's a 2022 NEA Jazz Master. Andrew Zimmer, chef TV personality. Pamela Peresky, Dr. Bob O'Meally, Robert G. O'Meally, Columbia University. Farah Jasmine Griffin, Columbia University. Thomas Chatterton Williams, John Wood Jr., Braver Angels. I mean, there are many more I can name, but this is going to be a fantastic event that reflects the title, but has a particular centering on the work and thought of Albert Murray, who coined the term Omni-American. And I sure hope folks will register by going to event.omniamerican.org.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm, humbled adding myself to that list of participants. I hope to see everyone there. For more information, just go to the description box. The link will be there. I take care of y'all. Greg, Thomas, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me and thinking aloud. I really appreciate you. This podcast, Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason, is something that I'm still getting legs under. But my primary goal, my primary purpose in doing these kinds of discussions is to talk with folks like you and think aloud and work toward a shared vision for the future. So thanks again. And thank you for everyone participating. If you're not already subscribed, go ahead, subscribe, like, comment to help the algorithm, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you, Dr. Sheena.
Thank you.